Hello, and welcome back to Utah Tech Leads interview series. Today we have with us our wonderful treasurer, Marlo Oakes. How are you doing today, treasurer?
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us today. We'd love to get your perspective on ESG and what you've been kind of able to do, honestly, across the country over the past year or so.
Yeah, no, thank you for this opportunity. I think it's important for people to understand, particularly in the context of what people might think of as values-based investment strategies. So, historically, socially responsible investing was the way a value investor might express their views with their portfolio. So religious organizations were very typical socially responsible investors. They have, certain values. They want to make sure that their investment portfolio is aligned, or at least not competing or contradicting those values. And so they would avoid certain investments, right? Tobacco, firearms, gambling. It's very typical industries or companies that they might avoid. ESG is different in that ESG has an agenda to achieve. So instead of divesting, ESG is engaging with companies and engaging with the marketplace to drive an agenda. And it's using the power of money to drive that agenda. And so it's very different from that perspective.
So who exactly is pushing ESG, and how do you see it kind of interacting at the state level?
So the first document that I know of that mentions ESG, those environmental, social, governance, those three words, was a document back in 2004 from the United Nations. And the United Nations invited several financial institutions to come together. And they said in that document, only if all actors, essentially commit to ESG, can any progress be made in this area. And so when you have an organization that has determined outcomes and gotten financial companies to agree to those outcomes, you're basically changing the marketplace. Because the only way a marketplace works is with innovation, with differences of thought, differences of opinion. When all actors come together and agree on an outcome, you no longer have a market.
So tell us a little bit about what those outcomes that ESG is trying to drive. What do you see those as?
So it's similar to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, where that particular system has 17 goals. ESG, I don't know if there's a specific number, but you have the E part, environmental, and of course the one that most people think about is climate change. And a lot of the way this is expressed in the marketplace is to have shareholder proposals put before companies that requires them to create goals or plans and adopt essentially the Paris Climate Accord, for example. So that's the E part, basically moving to net zero. And then on the social side, there's a lot of different proposals around racial equity audits, for example. So insurance companies being forced to create reports that frankly are illegal. I mean, it's not legal for insurance companies to underwrite their businesses based on their business based on race, right? And so a lot of the things that are being pushed through ESG are political issues that, for example, didn't make it through Congress with the Green New Deal, for example, or are illegal. And so it's very troubling. But I would say the biggest problem is that you have political issues that have now moved out of our political system and being pushed through business. And so it really goes around our constitutional form of government, our political bodies, and attempts to drive social issues through the corporation.
Yeah, totally understandable. And there was a lot of legislation this past year, or this past legislative session, I should say, not year, about ESG. There were some very understandable things that were put forth about how state government money is utilized. Those are totally understandable. Did you see any progress in those areas for what you're looking to accomplish?
Yeah, we had actually at one point there were, I think, 37 bill files open during the course of the year. So thankfully that those were whittled down, and we didn't have nearly that many bills. But the one I think SB 96 deals with investment portfolios, and then SB 97 deals with other entities that might be doing business with the state. And then there's a 449, I think, HB 449, that has to do with collusion of private actors. The whole goal, I would say, is to keep the capital markets free from politics. That's the ultimate goal. A lot of people think, well, anti-ESG is just mirror image of ESG and is promoting policies, on the right. That is absolutely not true. If you think about ESG putting its thumb on the scale, I would say the anti-ESG, at least the efforts that I'm working on, are to pull the thumb off of the scale so that there isn't politics being implemented in business. That's where the danger is. As soon as we allow businesses to drive political agendas, we all lose. It's not good for the marketplace. And we saw that, we've seen that example. For example, Disney, how politicized their business became, and then they didn't want to be political, and then they got in trouble for not wanting to be political. Silicon Valley Bank more recently, it's hard to say to what extent, focusing on non-bank issues, how much did that, lead to their downfall? But it certainly didn't help. Not having a chief risk officer, and then when the chief risk officer was on board, focusing on things that weren't necessarily risk related, they were more ESG related. And so, again, I don't know how much of that, distraction led to their downfall, but businesses that get distracted from their core business, it generally doesn't help.
Yeah, so you mentioned SB 97, which is about economic boycotts. I'm particularly curious in that arena. Are a lot of other states who've run similar but not exact legislation have had some analysis done that they're going to be losing a lot of money. How has Utah been able to craft a law that allows us to not go through the same struggles that other states might be seeing?
Yeah, so originally, I think the bills, not this year, but the prior year, Texas's original law was one of the first ESG bills came out, and it was based on that law that some analysis was done, said they're going to lose all this money. So our bill, and I think Texas and other states have added this, allows us flexibility where, like the treasurer has a fiduciary obligation. It allows me to fulfill that fiduciary obligation. If I don't have any other viable alternatives in the marketplace, then I am allowed to, contract with a company that might otherwise not be allowed. So it gives us an out based on our legal framework, and that's very important.
Do we have any companies that are currently holding contracts with the state that might be directly impacted? You don't have to name any companies, just kind of curiosity.
Not necessarily. We haven't done a full, review of companies, and so I think we're actually in a pretty good position in Utah, I think, overall, and so I don't anticipate having a major changes resulting from this. A lot of it is going to be prospectively, moving forward, being aware of the legislation. And, it's based on the Israeli anti-boycotting language, certainly SB 97. So it was placed in that part of the code. And so I would say it's more prospective.
Were there any times that you saw during this most recent legislative session where people were kind of straying into other areas where I know you're very ESG focused, but that might have kind of bled out into other areas?
Not so we had quite a few conversations with people. I think sometimes the concern with some of the legislation was actually a misunderstanding of what the legislation did. And so a lot of conversations with people that maybe were coming in later and trying to understand. But I think overall, I think the legislature did a really great job of managing the issue and taking like those 37 bills and narrowing them down to a manageable number and passing the ones that I think really made sense.
Absolutely. There was definite winnowing that was happening throughout the past year as well as through the legislative session. I know most of those bills have many substitutes and the language changed time and time again. Some of them went to a study item, some of them passed completely through. So it was kind of a wild ride this year.
Yes, yes. And, we have a very pro-business state. My concern is when we start politicizing and, we change how we're doing business in this country. We're really doing more than changing business. We're changing how we solve social issues, right? And how do we deal with societal differences that we all have. And that's a major concern because it ultimately changes our constitutional form of government and how we deal with differences. And I think a lot of people maybe don't understand what the implications are because ESG sounds good. It sounds positive. A lot of the language are things that all of us are concerned about, but it's the way we go about it. How do we address environmental issues? How do we address societal issues? How do we address, a lot of these things? It's really in my book, it's appropriate to put those before legislative bodies and keep businesses focused on business because that's ultimately how all of us benefit from the innovation that has happened and the goods and services that are provided to us.
Have you seen any other incentive-based investment tools that carry the same weight that you see with ESG?
I have not. I think traditional fiduciary standards, that where an investor is really focused on getting the best return for a given level of risk. I think that's an important standard that protects us from the politicization of our money. And I haven't seen, kind of another system that does that better than our traditional fiduciary standard and really trying to focus on where's the best place to place capital and allowing banks to be banks and insurance companies to be insurance companies. I think that's really important.
Absolutely. So we talked a little bit about SVB and the banking crisis that's been happening over the past week or so. How do you feel about Utah's banks and where Utah's abilities are and its stability right now?
Yeah, I think we're in pretty good shape. SVB is a very unique situation. They had very few, depositors, a lot of large institutional money. So, I think FDIC insurance was like 8% of the deposits, right? I mean, it was a really low amount. So kind of unique from that perspective. And I think, we've got a very strong banking system here in Utah. We're one of the top in the country. And so, just like with anything, a lot of it is a psychological game. and a bank run like we've seen in the movies, right? It's a Wonderful Life, everybody's trying to get their money out, and banks don't just sit there with money in the vault. They have it put to work and trying to manage that risk. I think we're in I think our institutions are strong here in the state, and we've got a lot of a diverse set of institutions, credit unions, banks, community banks, national banks, industrial banks, right? So I think overall we're in good shape.
Yeah, we're in a pretty good spot right now. I think it's been interesting to see the way that the state has reacted specifically to that crisis in its solid foundation of a banking system here.
Yeah, and we've always tended to be more financially conservative. Kind of going back to our roots. It's reflected in our credit rating, for example. We have the best credit in the world, AAA rated, and have never been rated below that. And I think that's sort of embedded in how we do business as a state, and so I think we're in good shape.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your time.
Well, thank you.
I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.